John Blaxland, joining from Washington, D.C. Welcome to online guest lecture in conversation with Professor John Blaxland, titled Revisiting ASEAN as a Regional Security Strategy, an Australia Perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce Professor John Blaxland, a distinguished scholar and expert in international security and intelligence, currently serving as the director of the ANU North America Liaison Office in Washington, D.C. He has been a professor at the Australia-National University since 2011, contributing significantly to security studies in the Asia-Pacific region. His extensive career includes serving as Australia's defense attaché in Bangkok, overseeing defense cooperation and military exercises, and directing intelligence operations at HQ Joint Operation Command, supporting Australian military operations globally. Beyond his academic and military achievement, Professor Blaxland has authored numerous influential publications, including United Front, Australia Needs a Military Alliance with Indonesia in 2024, Australian Regional Engagement, a Historical and Strategic Perspective in 2024, and Indonesia's Defense Dilemma in 2024. His research, writing, and public speaking continue to shape discussions on regional security and intelligence affairs. Before we begin, I would like to share some information about this session. Professor Blaxland will be speaking around 45 minutes, followed by Q&A sessions where you will have the opportunity to engage directly with him. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Blaxland. Professor John Blaxland, the time is yours.
Terima kasih Pak Enggar. Selamat pagi, selamat siang, selamat malam, selamat sore, depending on whereabouts on the planet you are right now. We are in very different time zones, and so I'm honored, delighted to join you. If I may, I'm going to turn on my slides, but I just need Enggar for you to give me permission to use my slides, and hopefully that's going to come shortly. There we are, and I'm now in a position to share my slides, and hopefully you can now see my first slide. Is that good, Enggar? Yeah?
Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. So this is my favorite map, and it is a Air Force planning map centered on Darwin, but spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Southeast Asia and of the significance of what Joko Widodo described as the maritime fulcrum. And of course, of the significance also of the Indo-Pacific, both to Indonesia and Australia. And of course, the connections between Australia and Indonesia and Southeast Asia. I really like that. So I hope this map will stick in your minds as worthy of reflection. So I have been pontificating, as Enggar pointed out, for quite some time. And I have, I run off, I can't help myself. I keep wanting to write things. So you'll have to excuse me for that. But one of the things I've done is looked at a paper called Adapting to Polycrisis and a Geostrategic SWOT Analysis for Australia. And in that, I looked at what a whole range of issues, the internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats. And you can have a look at that if you like. But the essence of this is that what we face today is great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges. So great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. And nobody owns this overlapping space in the middle. No government agency, no academic discipline, no jurisdiction, local, national, international, owns that space. And it leaves us with quite a dilemma because there are many challenges, and it's kind of like the polycrisis, or everything, everywhere, all at once, if I can riff off the title of that movie from a couple of years ago. But you can see what I'm saying. It's all happening, right? It's all happening. Accelerated, as I say, by the fourth industrial revolution, which is this physical cyber systems space, And that fourth industrial revolution is generating all sorts of issues: quantum computing, artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, big data, cyber physical systems, and it's disrupting business, entertainment, communications, transport, and national economies. It is huge, right? It's huge. It's affecting you, it's affecting me, it's affecting our countries, it's affecting the globe. So there's all sorts of ramifications arising from this. But, you know, I love my maps and I'm a simple guy and I need pictures. So here's another one, right? This is another one of my favorites, which is the Asia Pacific. And you think about the space that we sit on, that we share. I'd had this drawn for when I did my PhD comparing Canada and Australia. And so when we look at the Pacific, though, all we see is little dots, right? We don't see anything of any great consequence. You know, I've mentioned Guam and Hawaii there. Many other little dots, surely of no consequence. Well, hold that thought, because, of course, I think they do have some consequence. And, of course, another way of looking at the world is from Beijing's perspective, or the Middle Kingdom, if you like. And from this angle, the world does look different. And it is understandable from that angle why you would, if you were in Beijing, see the neighbors as perhaps owing a certain degree of deference to China. Another way of looking at this, though, is at the sea lines of communication. And here is what we call the Malacca dilemma. The Malacca Strait, which generates a significant vulnerability for the economies of Northeast Asia, because 70% of their trade, mostly oil, but not just oil and gas, flows through the Malacca Strait. And of course, I think this goes a long way to explain the Belt and Road Initiative. Firstly, the pipeline to the Bay of Bengal, the highways through Southeast Asia, to mitigate the risks associated with this. And of course, who lives in this space? Well, we do, right? ASEAN, Indonesia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So it's interesting, though, of course, because ASEAN, well, what is it? Is it a proto-great power? I think arguably you could say it is a proto-great power, but it doesn't have unlike the European Union, it doesn't have a central government. And that's partly because it has many, many differences, unlike Europe, which is essentially Latin-derived languages and Judeo-Christian derived culture and religion, right? So in Southeast Asia, of course, the diversity is phenomenal on ethnic, religious, economic, historical, geographic, political, strategic, cultural, and linguistic lines. And there is, of course, in terms of international relations theory, this idea that states in Southeast Asia are either balancing, hedging, or bandwagoning, depending on who you ask, right? Balancing, some people say it's the Philippines, Singapore, and Brunei. Balancing, in other words, siding with the United States. Hedging ones like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and perhaps Indonesia, depending on who you ask and how you define it. And of course, then there's the ones that seem to be bandwagoning, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia. But once again, I think this is still up for debate. So I flagged that there for you. We'll come back to this in the Q&A. But this is contested. This is contested conceptually, and it's contested practically as well. Now, in this space, of course, the demography of Southeast Asia shapes a lot of the politics and the economics. And of course, the very dense part of Indonesia where you're living speaks to a lot of the dynamics inside Indonesia. And I won't dwell on that, but I just flag it. I just want to go briefly through some of the other countries in Southeast Asia. Of course, Myanmar, with its incredible ethnic diversity, which has not, it has contributed to, but not driven exclusively, the civil war that has broken out and has been going now for nearly 3 years inside Myanmar, where contestation and control is seriously up for grabs, particularly in the northeast, the northwest, the north, and the southeast. The central Burman plains are least contested, but even so, there's still quite a lot of conflict in this space. Of course, in that space is the oil and gas pipeline down to Chakpu at the Bay of Bengal, from Kunming to Chakpu, which if we go back, of course, a couple of maps, you will recall that's that pipeline there, right? Which is all about mitigating the risks of the Malacca dilemma, right? So that's one of the reasons why Indonesia is so important as well, of course, because you are part of that space. Now, looking further around, the other Theravada Buddhist mainland Southeast Asian nations, other than Myanmar, here we're talking Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. They have, here's these maps of their ethnography. A very interesting mix here, of course, ethnography in Cambodia, more diverse than people think. That's mostly Khmer here, but there's Khmer pockets up in Thailand too, reflecting the diverse history of empires past. Of course, this long strip of Mon, but traditionally considered Burmese, right? But actually Thai citizens. And of course, the Malay Muslims of the Deep South, where conflict continues to this day, where Thailand's southern insurgency reflects a century of conflict and more conflict over the last 2.5 decades. And we can dwell on that. We can come back to that if you're interested. Of course, there's Mekong River challenges as well, with depleted fisheries, salination, water shortage, etc. Australia is actually quite actively involved with Thailand, with Cambodia, with Vietnam and Laos in actually mitigating the risks arising from these problems arising. Now, there's problems elsewhere, like in West Papua, where there are calls for justice and good governance, and some people call for independence. But of course, there is a fear, an understandable fear on one level in Indonesia, that Australia is going to do like we did in East Timor, where we helped East Timor become independent. But, you know, there are some very big differences, very important differences to note. One is West Papua is about 25 times bigger than East Timor, right? Australia barely coped with East Timor, and that was when you guys agreed to us doing it. So, so that's a very important point. We can't do anything in Papua unless you want us to, right? Secondly, East Timor was never recognized by the UN as part of Indonesia, whereas West Papua is recognized by the UN as part of Indonesia. So while there is concern about what happens in West Papua, the Australian government position, and by and large the position in Australia, is that we want Indonesia to sort it out, right? We don't want to be involved directly. We recognise it's your sovereign territory, but we also recognise there are problems, and we don't want them to get exacerbated, and we don't want them to feed the kind of views of protesters in Australia that makes it difficult for us politically to do more with Indonesia, because we are a democracy like you guys, right? So we're constrained by popular will. So popular will is important to have on site. And that's why we're really concerned that Indonesia continue to work to have justice and fairness and equity in the situation in West Papua or Papua. Then there's transnational security concerns. There's concerns about network extremists, the prospects of a return of so-called Daesh or the Islamic State. And of course, the concerns about a repeat of the Bali bombing threats of 20 plus years ago. And then there's other transnational concerns about transnational crime and piracy, etc. And now this manifests itself a little bit, particularly in the Philippines. And of course, the religious and ethnographic diversity, the diversity ethnographically of the Philippines, as well as in terms of religion, speaks to some of the political and social problems inside the Philippines, which have a spillover effect in the rest of maritime Southeast Asia, particularly in Borneo and Indonesia and Malaysia. So that's not in, and of course, the fighting of Marawi is around the lake there in the middle of the main island of Mindanao in the south. Now, the other one, of course, the big one is the South China Sea dispute, where we have the 9-dash line overlooking. Here's a pit that's, of course, of concern to Indonesia, the overlap between the 9-dash line and the exclusive economic zone of Indonesia arising from the Natuna Island territory, right? But of course, in this part of the South China Sea, there is incredible diversity of ownership. Vietnam, mainland China, Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, etc. Okay, it's just extraordinary, the diversity in that space. A very contested space that in 2016, the arbitral tribunal ruled in favor of the Philippines to say that none can lay claim to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone or a continental shelf arising from all of these islands, okay? But the rocks for the purposes of Article 21, which are entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, include Scarborough Shoal up here, and all of these ones listed here. It's pictured here as well. And these other ones, low tide elevations, they generate no maritime zone, including Subi Reef, which has been built out by the Chinese, Mischief Reef, and Second Thomas Shoal, which has been disputed, Second Thomas Shoal in this space here, where the Philippines has been done. Here's a picture of the 1947 9-dash line drawn by the Kuomintang government in China before the fall of the Kuomintang there. Now, we've seen in recent years a shift in the Philippines, their harder stance from Rodrigo Duterte, the previous president, who was soft, who walked back from the arbitral tribunal ruling of 2016 to get and won virtually no concessions from China for his generous position. And so we see Marcos takes over as president, and he basically reverses Duterte's soft line on China, and he acknowledges that that's not going to work, so they bring the Americans back in, and we see a reaffirmation of Philippines' ties with the United States. Very interesting dynamic at work there. And in the meantime, we've got significant geography at play affecting Indonesia and Australia and the space we share. Of course, the significance of the sea lines of communication that we touched on before, and the straits, the Malacca, Lombok, Sunda, Weta, and the Torres Strait. And of course, up here, we don't think about this very often, but India has the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are at the northern mouth of the Malacca Strait. So this is a consequential piece of real estate as well. Of course, we also have Cocos and Christmas Islands, which is south of Java down here, where Australian territory, and that's the demarcation point between Australia and Indonesia. Now, along the way, we have faced a pretty significant political upheaval with the emergence of President Donald Trump for his second term in office. And I'm describing this as a transactional retreat from ideational leadership. So you see here pictured Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0, this kind of denigration or the putting down of Vladimir Zelensky in a way that shocked most of the world, and yet which on one level seems to a calculated move to force Zelensky to back down, to be less absolute about his demands for the return of the Donbass and Crimea. We'll come to that in a moment. But anyway, it's a manifestation of what some people are saying is the abandonment of the rules-based international order. Now, I say the rules-based international order, it's kind of like the Holy Roman Empire, like of the Middle Ages, which was not holy, which was not Roman, and was not an empire. Right? So the rules-based order, careful what you wish for, because it's actually quite convenient, right? And yes, everybody can poke holes in the rules-based order and claim hypocrisy by the United States and everybody else. But every country has a good set of double standards, as I like to say. We all have a degree of hypocrisy in our foreign policy, foreign and economic policy. I think we should be honest about that and realistic. So it's interesting the dynamics at play here, walking back from the international institutions, the World Health Organization, the USAID, the Voice of America, and claiming Canada and Greenland and Panama. This is quite extraordinary and deeply traumatic for people, countries like Australia and Indonesia, believers in the rules-based order, and reliant on the rules-based order. Right. Now, and then there's the issue of tariffs, and this has had this is quite a clever graph showing the decline in stock arising from Donald Trump's actions, which he claims is going to be quickly reversed and they will recover. But nonetheless, the so-called beautiful tariffs have really had a very negative effect in the politics of countries like Australia and Canada, which have just had elections, as you know, and have just re-elected centre-left political parties into office. But at the same time, people are saying, oh, China will be able to cash in on all of this, will exploit America's transactional retreat from ideational leadership. But there's a good argument by Mary Gallagher in the World Politics Review that China will actually have trouble cashing in on Trump's global trade war. And that's an interesting one for us to think about because of Indonesia's circumstances and Australia's circumstances, and of course the rest of ASEAN. So now what? So it appears Trump aims to unbind the executive from constraints imposed by the other branches and the normal processes of administrative lawmaking. That's what this piece in the New York Times said in February. And what, as my mentor and supervisor for my PhD said to me recently, the left railed against globalism, hoping for a socialist global nirvana. And instead, it's got US Jacksonian nationalism, disinclined to care about international institutions, which I think is a really interesting way of describing what we are witnessing. It's not isolationism, it's mercantilist unilateralism. This is an important distinction. And it's, as I say, a transactional retreat from ideational leadership. And what does this mean? Is there going to be a great power carve-up? Is it a Yalta 2.0? This is a picture of Yalta 1944, when near the end of World War II, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin met to carve up the world, right? And they set the path for the Cold War, right? Arguably, there's this sense that Trump, Putin and Xi are going to carve up the world between them. But where are the borders? Is Europe really part of that equation? And is East Asia and Southeast Asia part of the Chinese domain? And how is that determined? And who decides? And how is that going to manifest? And how many wars will be fought to make that happen? These are huge questions that, as we see a shift in the global power dynamics, affect Australia, affect Indonesia, and draw us closer together. Now, as we think about this, when you look at the Lowy Power Index, it's very interesting to think from America, Americans tend to see China, China, China. But of course, from where we sit in the world, things look more diffuse. You can see many other countries having agency. And this Lowy Power Index has 8 measures of power. And I think they're quite interesting on economic, military, resilience, futures, resources, economic relationships, defense networks, diplomatic influence and cultural influence. And you can see there, Indonesia and Australia are in the mix, but so are the rest of ASEAN. And when you aggregate ASEAN, it's consequential. Of course, Indonesia, like others in Southeast Asia, have decided to join the BRICS. And on one level, that's the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa network. And on one level, that's quite understandable, with Indonesia wanting to have a bet each way with its non-aligned, bebas dan aktif kind of foreign policy priorities. It is understandable, if not necessarily all that welcome by Australia. But that's up for debate as well. In the meantime, we've seen Asian regional defense spending balloon in the case of China, and others are starting to try and catch up, but really from a low base, because China has gone exponential. And this
Attention all staff. Please be advised that the freight lift is currently out of service.
Yeah.
We do apologize for any inconvenience and are working on resolving the issue as quickly as possible.
Okay. Oh, yes. So just hang on for a second. Okay, sorry about that, folks. What I wanted to say was, here we have this very interesting summary of global trade shifts. Since China joined the World Trade Organization, it has gone from being the principal trading partner of a handful of countries to global dominance. Now, this has happened in 25 years. Now, think about the British Empire. For instance, the other European empires, the Dutch Empire as well, any of these European empires of old, they grew over about 250 years, right? So what happened was they had the Industrial Revolution, they then needed raw materials, they needed markets, they needed governance, they needed security, and that all happened incrementally over 250 years, okay? There was no manifesto back 250 years earlier saying conquer the world. It happened incrementally. I would contend something similar is happening with China. There's no manifesto to conquer the world, but it is happening as China's economy expands exponentially. Its trade leads to need for raw materials, needs for industry, needs security, and with that comes the influence of governance. So we're only 25 years into this. Who knows what the next 25 years will look like? But I think the parallel of empires of old, but on steroids and compressed in the timeline, is a useful metaphor for us to think about the new world we're living in. Now, no one knows what the future holds. We don't know what's going to happen, but it is still very interesting to think about how China's power, economic power and military power is going to expand in coming times and what that means for us and how we respond. Now, as we think about responding, it's useful to think about the dimensions of national power, right? There's land, sea, air, space, and now cyber, but all along we've had the cognitive domain, right? The human domain. And of course, all facing these challenges we talked about before. I would contend in the West, we've tended to fixate on Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote his book On War, drawing on the lessons from the Napoleonic era. And the metaphor in the West is the game of chess, where you're trying to checkmate the king. I would contend we should be thinking more about the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, for whom the acme of skill is to defeat one's adversary without fighting. It's an important point. And the metaphor in terms of a game is Go. Now, in the game of Go, you're not aiming to remove all the players, you're aiming to envelop them and co-opt them and win by dominating the play. Anyone imagine a country that might be operating like that? One or two come to mind. I think a few of you might be thinking the same thing. But when we think about cyberspace, that fifth domain, it's useful to think about it as more than just the physical or the virtual, but also the cognitive. So here I'm talking about not the hardware or the software, but the wetware, right? The 6 inches or the 15 centimeters between our ears, where the real battle takes place. But of course, in addition, we've got this hardware issue of cables undersea, because we've gone from being web-enabled to web-dependent and in turn web vulnerable, with the vulnerability arising from our dependence on the web. You know, when I grew up, there was the post office, there was the bank, and you carried cash, and you had a checkbook, and you made transactions you bought a newspaper, you had a television, you had a radio, you had a typewriter. All of these things have been taken over by one device, by one thing, the web, which is wonderful. It's very clever. It's very empowering, but it's incredibly vulnerable. It leaves us so vulnerable, which leads us down this path of the cyber security space, right? And for Australia, we've seen the emergence of cyber as the fifth domain, and I talk about this in my book, Revealing Secrets. This idea of this once very secretive body, the Australian Signals Directorate, actually having a very important public-facing task. So these hoodie-wearing, basement-dwelling, introverted geeks of old now have had to reinvent themselves to engage the public, to engage society, to help us all figure out how to do cybersecurity, how to protect ourselves from malicious cyber attacks, both from state and non-state and criminal networks. In this space, of course, I think we have what I would contend is a thing called unrestricted competition. Now, it riffs off this book by these two Chinese colonels from the late 1990s called Unrestricted Warfare. And they talked about psychological, media, legal, and economic warfare. But the term warfare is not one that sits comfortably with us because we are at peace, aren't we? Aren't we? Well, kind of, right? But if we take away the word warfare and insert the word competition, click, 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 all of a sudden, that all falls into place. That's actually going on right now. So we're facing this competition prism where we've got to collaborate on a range of things and cooperate on others. We compromise as well where we need to, and contest where we can, and confront where we must, and hopefully avoid conflict as well. But this is an accelerated environment, a very complex interplay of geopolitics, threat, technology, and domains. It's not black and white. It's not simple. It's really complicated, right? This is the world we live in today. So when we think about the prospect of war, okay, war happening in East Asia, that Indonesia and Australia may have to think about and respond to, at least in a policy decision, what do we do? How do we respond? I think it's useful to think about the most common scenario thought about now is about a war over Taiwan. I'm actually fairly sanguine about this. I think China will continue to squeeze and not necessarily overtly seize Taiwan. And the former Prime Minister, now Ambassador here in Washington, Kevin Rudd, I think is right in saying that we can manage strategic competition, in part because of the echoes of the Korean War. The Korean War happened when, a long time ago, but essentially China lost 1 million men and Mao Zedong's son was killed in the Korean War. So no self-respecting Chinese leader wants that to happen again, right? You want this to happen without that happening. So that I think is an important factor. And Kevin Rudd's written another excellent book on Xi Jinping thought, and he makes the point that she's a Marxist-Leninist nationalist. So he's a Marxist in the sense he really believes in communism. He's a Leninist in that he really believes in the Communist Party as the party state and him in charge of the party, right? And then it's nationalist in that it is about revenge for the century of humiliation. And it is with this in mind that we see a policy of a nuclear arms race, seeking the secure return of Taiwan, actively building up in the South China Sea, pushing back in the East China Sea, pressing buttons in India, wedging the United States in Europe, and trying to dominate economically in East Asia and beyond. This is all presenting a significant challenge, and this is manifesting itself in our neck of the woods with Xi Jinping saying China is ready for war, and China circumnavigating Australia and going through the archipelagic waters of Indonesia, right? Nothing to worry about, surely, or maybe not. I don't know, but it is a little bit alarming, right? So here's another thing. This has happened. These territories, this is America, the blue is US aligned territories, right? And US bases in Japan and Korea. That's US territory, they're all US territories. What's happened in the last few years, China has arranged security pacts with Solomon, Kiribati, Tonga, and is doing another one with the Cook Islands as well in here. This has happened just in a very short period of time. And the geopolitics in the Pacific is something that most people don't appreciate. And Southeast Asian countries have an interest in what's going on here, okay? They really do, because this has a knock-on. If the US disengages from here, it has a knock-on effect on its engagement here. And I talk about the reverse opium war. This is part of that century revenge for the century of humiliation, I would contend, where China is basically, if not actively involved, and certainly turning a blind eye to the proliferation of drug networks passing through the Pacific and into Australia, through Southeast Asia and beyond. Clearly, these are issues of concern. Now, when we look at it from an Australian point of view, we have what I call the 10 dialectics, or the 10 points of tension about who we are with where we are. And I'm just going to go through some of them. I commend this article to you, and I'm happy to share and go the slides afterwards for people who want to revisit some of this material. But essentially, there are 10 points of tension, and a couple of them are that we're reconciling our history with our geography. So we're Anglo-Europeans transplanted, sitting on the edge of Asia, right? And that makes for a confused sense of identity. Because what are we? Are we Europeans? Not quite. Are we Asians? Not quite, right? We have increasingly a very cosmopolitan community with a lot of people from Southeast Asia, East Asia, and South Asia. So about half the country, 25% of the country has one relative or more born overseas. So it's a significant part of the population. But Australia is a middle power with small power pretensions, I would contend. Australia is about the size of continental United States, but, in the US, they have the explorers called Lewis and Clark, who go across the United States. They find lush rivers and valleys and lakes, right? Look, plenty of land of opportunity. In Australia, we have Burke and Wills. Well, what happened to Burke and Wills? They die in the desert, right? Australia's a desert. It's a desert island with a fertile rim around the edge. So that's one of the reasons why we're a middle power with small power pretensions, because we're struggling enough. We've got enough challenges in our patch, So this is a reason why I think it explains partly our foreign policy, or our lack of ambition in terms of engagement globally. We also have a second dialectic, is the fear of abandonment. So we've had, because of the experience of World War II, and a fear of entrapment. So we don't want to be left alone. We don't want the United States to leave the neighborhood. We also don't want to get sucked into a war in Taiwan or somewhere else. So we want the Goldilocks solution, right? The just right solution. Everybody does. We want the Goldilocks answer. So we can deal with our fear of abandonment and our fear of entrapment and be happy. Of course, the real world is more complicated than that, as you know. And we also have this dialectic of defense of Australia versus forward defense. So in the two world wars, we go forward, we go to Europe, or we go to Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, and we deploy forces in this space. And then we go to Korea, we go to Vietnam, we go to Afghanistan and Iraq, and in between we come home and sit behind the moat, right, on our happy little island. But we have, and this is something that's really worth remembering, in the past, when we last faced an existential crisis before the foundation of Indonesia as an independent nation, we fought extensively in the Indonesian archipelago. So there are many battles fought in Ambon, in Timor, in Rabaul, in Morotai, in Balikpapan, in Tarakan, etc., that are famous in Australia because we fought against the Japanese there, right? Now, most people in Australia and most people in Indonesia don't know that, right? But the point is that Indonesia is incredibly important to Australia. If for nothing else, that it's in extremis where we have to work with you to defend our shared territory, right? When we lost what happened here, we had troops in Ambon, we had troops in Timor, Kupang, Dili, Java, Singapore, and Rabaul. We lost for a while, and what happened? The Japanese then used Ambon, Dili, Kupang, etc., to bomb Australia, right? So that speaks to our fear of abandonment, right? And so you guys, whether you like it or not, are important to us, right? in this reflection of our fears of history gone past. So actually our relationship with Indonesia is incredibly important to us, okay? And that's one of the reasons why the freshly elected new Prime Minister, the same old Prime Minister, is going to Jakarta as his first port of call. Indonesia really matters to Australia, even though sometimes we don't play our cards very well. And interestingly enough, there's a very piece by Eleanor Noor, I think it's a very good one, on the China-US rivalry, saying Southeast Asia is no one's prize. We don't have to think of it as a prize. We don't have to think of it as binary. But let's quickly review some other things about what Australia does in the neighbourhood. We have this thing called the Defence Cooperation Program, which I've written about in my book, The Australian Army from Whitlam to Howard, and a little bit also in this book on An Army of Influence. We've been doing this for 60 years across Southeast Asia and beyond, multifaceted, involving educational ties at our military college, individual activities at staff colleges, defence colleges, master's scholarship, including at my university, the ANU. Thailand, for instance, very interesting. Thailand, the king of Thailand went to the Royal Military College Duntrue. And when we needed help in the East Timor crisis of '99, Thailand was the first country to help to volunteer. So it was actually quite significant. We have quite a lot of engagement across the air, sea, lands, special forces, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief between our two countries that endures. We have very close ties also with through the 5-power defence arrangements with Singapore and Malaysia. And the purpose, of course, this goes back to 1967, where it was after Konfrontasi, and it was essentially set up. Shh, don't tell anybody. It was set up because of Konfrontasi, right? There was a fear in Malaysia and Singapore that maybe Indonesia would do it again, right? But Sukarno is gone. That's not going to happen again. There's no fear of that now. So why do we still have FPDA? Why do we still have this 5-power defence arrangement? Well, the thing is that everybody still likes it because we all get to play with each other. We all get to go and exercise and cross-check each other and compare and contrast how good we are with each other. And it's quite a good learning and networking opportunity. And now even Indonesia has liaison officers to it because it's kind of seen as a good thing. Understandably, Indonesia doesn't want to join, but it's interesting to think about. Now we're running out of time, but Malaysia is in there. The Singapore, that we've got a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with roadmap for closer economic relations, defence relations, etc. We're close with the Philippines. We've helped them with dealing with challenges in Marawi, where we've got good relations with Brunei, as do you. And we've even with countries that are considered to be bandwagoning with China, Australia has good relationships with, including Laos and Cambodia. Myanmar, not so good because of the coup, but we have tried in the past to establish good relations. And that's not been so effective. We can only hope that that will change as pressure is applied on Myanmar to end the civil war. So as we think, stepping back from this now to think about the re-election of Donald Trump, the prospects of Australia's defence being dependent on the whim of Donald Trump points to a need for us to muscle up on our own. I wrote a couple of months back, and I think this applies to Indonesia as well. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why we're seeing Indonesia and Australia cooperating more closely together than just about ever in history. And partly this reflects what I'm calling Australia's foreign policy plan B, which is the 2017 foreign policy white paper, when Donald Trump last came to office. And basically we thought, okay, there's a degree of uncertainty about what this means. So let's reach out to everybody else who'll be our friend. ASEAN, the Pacific Islands Forum, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the Quad, AUKUS, 5-power defence arrangement, NATO, France, Australia, New Zealand, all of these security arrangements and free trade agreements like Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, IACEPA, Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, Australia-ASEAN New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, Singapore, etc. All of these, they're all part of the realm of Australia reaching out collaboratively in a networked way with its neighbours. And we've seen also an attempt to reconcile our economic and national security, trying to explain to the Americans that we have trade relations with Southeast Asia and with China and beyond that are not that they don't need to be seen to be challenging our security ties with the United States. Of course, for Australia, our ties with ASEAN and the region are really foundational. They're very consequential. And here we see the centrality of ASEAN with ADMM+, CSCAP, ASEAN Regional Forum, APEC, etc., all very significant. And of course, the importance of regional forums to ASEAN, all of these various forums are ones where Australia plays. They've got overlapping remits. They point to complex regional security arrangements. They help mitigate the precariousness of regional relations. They have progress, but it's incremental. They stress ASEAN centrality, unity and diversity, and they do enable great power engagement. So these are really positive, even though there are lots of them. And there's some competition or competing frameworks, particularly when we think about pressure for the Indo-Pacific concept. And I really like the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which Indonesia came up with and invited ASEAN member states to join. And in that mix, there's a lot of unilateral partnerships. So this is mindful of the limitations of ASEAN-related forums because of the requirement for unity and in unanimity and decision-making. So we have a range of other mechanisms, and you do too, in this space that are multilateral, including on the trade agreement front. So Australia and Indonesia share quite a number of free trade agreements, and we're looking to enhance that as we think about ties into the future. We also have that relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom with AUKUS, which, while it was not handled very well up front, I would contend it's had bipartisan support in both the United States and in Australia. It will chug along slowly but surely. You want us, I would contend, to have these good submarines because we've got your back, essentially. You don't have to worry about down south. You can worry about your archipelago and worry north, confident that we have this patch and down here pretty well covered collaboratively with you. We can talk about that more. In the meantime, we're facing increased environmental challenges and the prospect of increased floods, fires, pandemics, cyber attacks and terrorism, all combining, which is, people call this the Anthropocene, if you like. It's going gangbusters. Now, in terms of bilateral Australia-Indonesia relationships, we've been playing a game, what I call snakes and ladders, right? Where we go increment, the board game with snakes and ladders. You go up the ladder one step at a time, then you hit a snake and down the bottom you come again. And we've done it over beef, over boats, over spies, over clemency, over Papua, over Jerusalem. Look, most of that is now in the past, okay? We haven't had problems like that for about 10 years now. And I think in part it's because we're both countries seeing the need to work more closely together. Because the challenges, remember the Venn diagram, great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance challenges accelerated by the Fourth Industrial Revolution affect us both equally. And so in that context, the CEPA, the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, is really consequential. And it's great to see some progress happening there, although I would contend more progress needs to happen. And Pillar 1, enhancing economic and development of partnership. Pillar 2, connecting people. Pillar 3, securing the region and our shared interests. And that's with defence cooperation, combating transnational crime and cyber issues. So there's all these points of cooperation and collaboration between our countries that are unprecedented. And this is also on the development front, partnership on joint objectives for equitable and sustainable economic transformation, climate resilient communities, and strong institutions with hundreds of millions of Australian dollars assigned to do this. Now, with Prabowo's coming along, there's been what's been described as seamless presidential transition, where he's inherited the unfinished business of Jokowinomics, if you like, and this leaves the way for Indonesia and Australia and Southeast Asia, ASEAN more broadly, to be seeing ourselves more as strategic partners than fickle friends. And this is, I think, really important for Australia. I think it's really important for Indonesia. The Indonesia Defence Agreement has been reinforced last year, which replaces the cooperation arrangements from past, and it bolsters strong defence cooperation, deepening dialogue, strengthening interoperability, and enhancing practical arrangements. And basically, it helps support each other's security and contribute to the stability of the region that we share. And that's led to the increased tempo of Australian Defence Force Transnational Indonesia exercises, including Caris Woomera and various activities that are really previously not heard of before, of Australia and Indonesia working really closely, collaboratively in a trusted manner, which is exciting to see. I'm really happy to see this. Now, along the way, a friend of mine, Sam Rogovan, has argued that we should have a military alliance with Jakarta. But because that goal remains so distant, the best we can do for now is to encourage closer defence cooperation. Now, I don't think we need to go much beyond what we've got with the defence agreement, but I think that additional closer defence cooperation is a good thing. And my proposal to do that is through MANIS. MANIS, as you know, is the Indonesian word for sweet. And I'm proposing it also as an acronym for Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Singapore, right? Thank you. Terima kasih. But I think it's also worth expanding. So why MANIS? To allow for better control of maritime resources and maritime domain awareness. Existing forums in some ways are a little bit inadequate, and there's a niche alignment for the MANIS countries. And after all, multilateralism is in vogue. Yes, there may be another way with MANIS, and I wrote about this in Jakarta Post a few years ago. So the core, the why MANIS? Well, it's the core of the Indo-Pacific, right? It's the fulcrum, Joko Widodo described it. That's the space where MANIS sits, right? And there's no other entity that speaks to our shared interests about this maritime corner of the Indo-Pacific and the Southwest, the maritime Southeast Asian space we share, right? Now, I'm now proposing MANIS PPTT, which is Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Timor, and Thailand as possible members, because of the fact we share much of the space in around here, okay? We're doing stuff together and we work closely. So what could that MANIS forum look like? Well, a maritime regional cooperation forum could be formed, could generate goodwill, could be track 1.5, working on non-traditional security issues, fisheries, smuggling, trafficking, terrorism, climate change, cybersecurity, etc. It could involve police, immigration, border security, legal, judicial, environmental, intelligence, financial, and other working groups. And we could do with a lead agency. So it could be our Department of Foreign Affairs and perhaps another government agency like Department of Home Affairs, perhaps that to deepen engagement across the MANIS spectrum, if you like. It would not make redundant regions other forums. It could have overlapping areas of interest and engagement, and it could more effectively and decisively generate cooperative action, avoiding the need for ASEAN consensus on issues that are specific to the MANIS countries, right? And circumventing Chinese demands for bilateral engagement, where we want multilateral engagement. All right, so that's MANIS. Hopefully that's been persuasive. Now, in the meantime, why MANIS is important is increasing because of the scan of global catastrophic risks of nuclear weapons, of state food security, of society and climate challenge, of so many issues that we face on biosecurity, etc. We need to cooperate more than ever. And in that space, we've got ASEAN and we've got the bottom line, great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. So ladies and gentlemen, ASEAN, a regional security strategy, a view from down under, we have a lot in common, a lot of overlapping and shared interests. We need to sweeten ties between our countries, and it would help if you come and study in Australia as well. Okay. I'll leave that one up. You can get that. You can use that QR code if you're interested in exploring, doing some study in Australia. But I think at that point I'll end, and I will invite Inga for you to take over and field some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor John Blackland. This is a quite interesting materials that you share to us. We can know from a different perspective, and we can see from the point of view of Australia that Southeast Asia is as not only strategic geopolitically, but also strategic partners in order to maintain regional and international security as well. We can see that from the diversity of Southeast Asia itself, it then create a various security issue that you already discussed, traditional, non-traditional, and the presence of big power in the regions from China, United States, and you also uh, show how current dynamics, especially what happens in the US, can also impacting all of us. And this is also the interesting fact that you show us that Australia has fear of an abandonment and also fear on entrapment. This is an interesting view to see about the well to make sense about Australia's foreign policy to Southeast Asian countries. And um, your proportion, your proposal also interesting on monies, and yeah, it's quite interesting because how you see that Australia and Southeast Asia countries can engage more, especially in security matters, and how we can also have alternative forums outside ASEAN, even though we can see, I believe there is also a debate on that because we can see many Southeast Asian countries also try to ensure the ASEAN centrality that you already mentioned before. But I think this is a very good proposal that we can also discuss more in the future. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Blaxland. Now we will continue to the Q&A sessions. For all the participants, please, you can raise hand in the Zoom, or you can also write down your questions on the chat box. Okay, let's start with Pak Hangga Fatana here. Please, Pak Hangga.
Thank you so much, Pak Enggar. Thank you so much, Professor Blaxland, for your insightful explanation, particularly on the dilemma of the strategic tension between Australia's fear of abandonment and fear of entrapment, as Pak Enggar also highlighted, as the involving U.S. posture in the Indo-Pacific. I wonder actually if the recent federal election result 2 days ago, where Labour government secured renewed mandate with landslide victory, might offer something what we call as a moment of recalibrations of this sort of foreign policy orientation. Do you see the Albanese government would like to use its stronger position to navigate this tension differently than before? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Hungo. So it's hard to know because I have not seen any official pronouncements from the new government. I was listening on the weekend to some news interviews with the treasurer who was saying that the government's going to stick to the policies it announced before, and it's not planning to deviate from them. So if that's the case, what it means is the emphasis that I've been talking about on engaging more with Indonesia, more with Southeast Asia and the Pacific, while at the same time continuing to maintain our ties with the United States and other countries. Going back to that 2017 foreign policy white paper, I actually think it's got enduring relevance because it's about, as I say, it's trying to reach into all all of the networks and maintain all of the ties that we can, with a focus more on Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but reaching out for where it's useful, where there's a comparative advantage to stay engaged with Europe, with Japan, Korea, the US, and elsewhere, and India for that matter, to bolster, to gain the advantage that you can. And there's an interesting trilateral I didn't mention between Australia, India, and Indonesia, and I think there's some real potential there for that to become more consequential as well. So broadly, I think we're going to see more continuity than change. There probably will be some change around the margins, though. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you so much, Pak Hangga. Maybe we can move on to the next questions. Here is Deva Soka Farid Aziz raising hand. Please, Mas Deva. Yes, please, Mas Deva, you can ask the question.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for delivering this extraordinary material. Previously, I apologize in advance for not being able to turn on the camera because my internet connection is unstable. For my question, Professor, you talk about a US retreat from additional leadership. How do you think this shift is affecting ASEAN's confidence in the US as a partner? Thank you, Professor.
So it's a great question, thank you. And it's one that is deeply worrying in Australia and elsewhere as well, for that matter. I think the metaphor I like to use is the United States has always had a mailed fist, right? It's always had a strong military power backed by its economic power. And it's had a velvet glove. So it's couched things in terms of rules-based order, democracy, human rights, things like that. But American interests essentially have always been about hard power. We see in this administration they've just taken the glove off. They're not pretending anymore. It's about America's interests. It's about hard power, and it's about how you can complement America's interests. To a certain extent, it's always been that way, but it's been dressed up in a way that's been more politically palatable. But as I say, for countries like Australia and Indonesia, we've been enormous beneficiaries of the rules-based order, right? And here's a little example. We sell iron ore, right? We sell iron ore to China. We are confident it's not going to get sunk by torpedoes, right? It's not going to get taken over by pirates. And when it gets to the other end, the company at the other end will pay. And if they don't fully pay, we can take them to an arbitration tribunal and have a decision made in our favour. That is the rules-based order manifested in one example. That is hugely beneficial for small to medium powers like Australia and Indonesia. It has meant we have not had to spend 4 or 5% of GDP on defence to protect our ships in convoy going to sell iron ore or whatever to whoever, right? We've been able to rely on the system, the rules-based international order, as incomplete, as imperfect as it is. So for the United States to de-emphasize its support of that, it's deeply unsettling, right? I think, though, in practice, we will see, and I think we are seeing, broadly speaking, the United States continuing to uphold much of the infrastructure of the rules-based order. So the US Navy is still operating, the 7th Fleet still, the US fleets still go transit the Pacific, they go to the Middle East, they're transiting across the Atlantic. They're still exercising American military dominance, military power, in a way that kind of reinforces the underpinnings of the rules-based order, even if they are not publicly being so forthcoming and positive about that order. In part, I think that's because they are trying to goad countries like Australia, like Canada, like others around the world that who spend less than the United States does on defence, including Indonesia, to goad us to do more for ourselves, to do more, to look after our patch better. And in part, I think that's a reflection of a manifestation that the United States now recognises it's no longer the hyperpower that they used to be described as. It's now one of many powers and one of several powers. And this is what I was saying with the Yalta 2.0, U-Point 2.0 metaphor. There seems to be a recognition in the United States that, okay, Europe, you're going to have to do Europe, right? So this dismissing of NATO countries and generating an existential angst inside Europe is actually a reflection of the United States saying, oh, you guys have to do more. You actually have to do more for yourself, right? Because we actually want to reorientate towards East Asia, because that's the pacing threat, That's what the Indo-PACOM Command calls it. Now, there's a big debate at the moment as in the US as to whether or not that sentiment, the pivot, Barack Obama called it the pivot to Asia, right? Well, Donald Trump is never going to call it the pivot to Asia, right? Because that was Obama's idea. He can't use a word that was Obama's. He's got to come up with a new one. They haven't come up with a new one yet. But in competition is this isolationist, America first strand of politics. And this is echoing the isolationism of the United States of the 1930s. But it's in competition with that transactional unilateral internationalism. So, and it's not settled. But Mike Waltz is seen, who's just been removed as the National Security Advisor, to become the ambassador to the UN. Now, he made some silly errors with use of signal and then including a journalist in the group, unbelievable. But anyway, it is what it is. He, though, is considered one of the more strongly internationalist of the senior leadership in the White House. So there's a debate as to whether or not this marks a gradual decrease of the internationalist strand of American power, if you like, to a more isolationist one. Now, I hope that's not right. I don't know, though. It's too early. In fact, a friend of mine, colleague, said, John, 3 months into a presidency is too early to make pronouncements about a presidency. And he uses George W. Bush as a point of reference, who won office in 2000, took office in 2000 and 2001, January 2001. For the first 8 months of his presidency, all he did was focus on China, right? And yet it's not what we remember George W. Bush for. Right? We remember George W. Bush for 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, right? So the point is, these are really early days. Let's not jump to too many conclusions about what we're seeing and what that means, because we don't really know. Maybe Trump is actually as clever as he thinks he is. And maybe that's by default, maybe that's by a cunning game plan. But people who are pronouncing categorically that he is useless and that he's wrong and that it won't work, it's a hypothesis. It's not yet proven one way or the other. So we need to a certain extent, suspend judgment, mindful that there's a hypothesis you can put out there about what's happening and what it means, and then try and, hedge your bets in terms of Indonesian foreign and defence policy priorities and economic policy priorities, and same for Australia. So how do we engage? What do we do? What do we do to try and reduce tariffs? I mean, the tariff move, very interesting. The tariff move it's very transactional, right? And it's not ideational. And it has left a bad mark. I think it's contributed to the electoral outcomes in Canada and Australia. I think there's no question about that. But it's still early days. It may actually work for Trump. So, you know, we may look back in 4 or 5 or 10 years' time and think that was an ugly but clever move. I don't know yet. It's too early to say. But there's people who are categorically denouncing it. I'm thinking, oh, come on, you're just being partisan. You know, you're not being truly intellectually objective about this, because it's too early to say. The evidence is not there, one way or the other. Terima kasih.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. Blaxland. Maybe we can move on to the questions on the chat box. The first questions coming from Jami. He has 2 questions. The first about would you say that Indonesia function as a kind of buffer zone between Australia and countries to its north, particularly China? And the second questions about a close cooperation or collaboration between Australia and the US, and how do you view this strategic alignment and what implications might it have for Australia's regional autonomy?
So that's a really good question. I could have added, I nearly added an extra slide on this notion, one of the dialectics Australia faces, and that is about Australia being a dependent ally, which is a book by Coral Bell. She wrote the book about Australia being a dependent ally. Let me see if I can pull it up. Let's see if I can find it. And an independent ally. So the point being that Australia's, here we are. I'll see if I'll pull this one up. I'm going to project it. I'll show you. It's really worth seeing. Let's see if I can, if I may, if I'm still able to share, I'll share the slide. This one, yeah. You see there, these 2 books. They seem to be contradictory. Now, Coral Bell is the grand dam, if you like, of international relations in Australia. She wrote this book, Dependent Ally, looking at Australian foreign policy and how we're dependent on the United States. We used to be dependent on Britain, now we're dependent on the United States on a whole range of fronts, right? But then conversely, Shannon Tao, in this, in my view, masterful thesis, makes this case that Australia is actually an independent ally. And it actually makes its own mind up. It just so happens that as it makes its mind up, it sees its interests overlapping with the United States more often than not. And I think that's a fairly compelling case. And it's on that basis that Australia decides, because the decision is made in Canberra by a cabinet, by the Prime Minister and the senior executive, what are we going to allow the Americans to operate submarines out of Fremantle? Yes. Are we going to allow US B-52s to operate out of Darwin? Yes, maybe, but on conditions, right? Are we going to allow them to stockpile, allow the Singaporeans to stockpile equipment in Queensland at the Shoalwater Bay, this one here, the Shoalwater Bay training area? What do we do about Taiwan? You know, are we going to support the United States or not? Now, that's the decision for the Australian government to make. We continue to be engaged in Korea. We don't call what we do in the South China Sea FONOPS, because that's American terminology, but we effectively do something like that. And we keep a presence in the Middle East, a modest one, to be fair, but we keep doing that. So this is the dialectic, if you like, the points of tension in Australian foreign and defence policy. we like to think we're self-reliant, but we're not very self-reliant. We're actually quite reliant on the Americans for a lot of stuff. But our defence force is such that we've got a boutique defence force, I like to say, structured for the unipolar moment. It's actually very small, much smaller than the Indonesian military, and it's good. It's very high quality, but it's tiny. And that's because it reflects the fact that we've relied on the US, on the rules-based order that the Americans have defended, and we've felt we can just contribute to help them a little bit, but really they do the heavy lifting. And now, of course, there's a question, well, maybe they won't do so much of the heavy lifting. Maybe we do need to muscle up. Maybe you do too, Indonesia and Australia. We need to kind of think about doing more for ourselves to guarantee the integrity and the security of our own maritime space. So there, hopefully that's answered that question.
Thank you, Prof. Blaxland. And maybe on the first questions, do you kind of agree with assumptions on Australia using Indonesia as buffer zone with
the buffer zone?
Yes.
Yeah. So look, I mean, the geography is pretty clear. You guys effectively, I'm just going to go here and show you this one. I mean, from where we sit, you guys look like a buffer zone, right? That's the geography. The geography suggests that, Indonesia sits between Australia and where we have faced threats from in the past, right? 1942, the threat came from the north. It happened to be Japan, but it came through Indonesia, right? And around the east as well, across right that space. But what happens in Indonesia, this is why we care about Indonesia, because what happens to you will eventually happen to us, right? So we don't want it to happen to you because we don't want it to happen to us, which is one of the reasons why we're investing in our relationship with Indonesia in a way we haven't for a long time, because we haven't been thinking for a long time that that was even an issue, that we would need to defend this space, right? But now we're thinking, well, maybe we will one day. Maybe we actually do have to defend this space, in which case we really need to do it with Indonesia. We can't do it on our own. It's fundamentally important that Australia and Indonesia collaborate, Now, we understand you've got bebas dan active foreign policy, foreign and defence policy. You don't want to be formally allied. That's fine. No need to be. We're doing a lot already in defence, enhanced defence cooperation, all those things, EACHEPA, engagement, foreign policy on counter-terrorism and policing, on education. We're doing more than we have in ever, and which is great. I'm really happy about that. There's more we can do. There's more we should do. And this conversation we're having, I'm hoping is helping in that, because this is terrific, Inga. I'm really glad to have this opportunity for this conversation. It's terrific.
Thank you, Prof. Blaxland. Maybe we can move on to the next questions. This one is from Zati Saada. As you already mentioned about the concern on the security issues, traditional and non-traditionals, one of the concern of Zati Saada is about the refugee issue in the ASEAN and also Australia, since there are a lot of refugee that try to reach out to Australia, but they also struggling to find a place in some part of Southeast Asian countries as well. They are scattered in some Southeast Asian countries. She asked about your perspective on these issues.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. It's a very difficult one. There's about 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh right now. And, we've had a wave of Rohingya refugees before, about 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago now. And it generated enormous governance challenges for Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, and it generated considerable tension between us as we kind of argued with each other about who was responsible and whose fault it was. And it was no one's fault. It was kind of it happened to us, you know. So Australia has, you know, the politics of Australia are an interesting mix of factors. We've got to remember that it's only 55 years ago that we got rid of the white Australia policy, which was quite a racist policy in favour of Anglo-Europeans. In the 55 years since then, we have become a very cosmopolitan country. Like literally 1/3 of the country doesn't look like me, right? They look different. They look different. And that's been broadly and widely praised and accepted and celebrated in Australia. But there are rub points, and there's a marginalised element of society that creates points of tension. So that relates to a sense of being disenfranchised, a sense of being marginalised, but it also relates to issues concerning housing and affordability and tax rates and things like that. And there is, in certain quarters, a sense that we need to be very careful about how many refugees we let into the country, right? So successive governments have played with this. We've varied one way or the other about being lenient or strict about who we let in. And when we've been lenient, it's kind of opened up, it's become a torrent. And it's partly been facilitated by some corrupt elements in Indonesia, which has been a way station for a lot of people. But it's bigger than that. It's not Indonesia's fault. It's a bigger regional problem, which is one of the reasons why I think Manis is an important proposition, because I think we need to work collaboratively with Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Australia, and beyond in managing the challenges arising out of Myanmar. We actually do take quite a lot of refugees. You know, a lot of countries do. I mean, poor old Bangladesh, it's got 1 million of them at the moment. Thailand's got 2 million, you know, from eastern Myanmar. So we, I think, need to be working collaboratively with our neighbours and our partners in ASEAN and beyond, particularly Bangladesh, to manage the challenge there before it becomes a crisis again for us. And so it's a bit of hard-nosed realpolitik involved. We've got to recognise the limits of the political tolerance in our societies, but also economically and physically, how many, you know, where are we going to put them? We actually are having a housing crisis at the moment in Australia. So there's a lot of factors there, but working together with Indonesia, and as I say, I think a Manis type proposal has enormous potential benefit for us collaborating and understanding each other's perspectives and looking to solve this problem before it comes to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Here is Miss Karina, our head of the department. Please, Miss Karina.
Thank you so
Hi,
much.
Karina.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much once again for taking the time to speak with us and also our students. My focus of interest is actually, like, I really don't know that much about Australia, but what I know is, as Pahang also mentioned earlier, you had an election recently, and Canada also recently has an election where Liberal Party won, and one of the reasons is because basically people of Canada didn't want to work with a leader who will not save them from Donald Trump. Do you think the same reason also happened to the election of Australia? Is there anything related to that that can bring the Labor's victory to this election? Do you think one of the reasons is because this concern regarding Donald Trump's vitality in his foreign policy and his other, many controversial policies as president, or is just the same timing but not really influential? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karina. So my PhD was about comparing Canada and Australian foreign and defence policy. So that's a very pertinent question to be asking me. I have a little bit of knowledge, insider knowledge. So there's a lot of parallels between Canada and Australia. Arguably, they're the two closest countries. They're both continent-spanning, federal, bicameral, cosmopolitan, New World, free market, English-speaking, constitutional democracies. There's not many in the world, okay? There's incredible parallels between Canada and Australia. Politically, our models are quite similar as well. We have a more powerful Senate than theirs. Their Senate is different to ours. But there's been a parallel. And of course, in Canada's case, the President Trump has talked about annexing Canada. And that was poison for the conservative political leader, Pierre Poilievre, because he had been espousing Trump-like policy positions that sank like a stone when Trump threatened annexation and imposed tariffs. That was catastrophic for the Conservatives in Canada. Now, it's not quite as catastrophic for the Conservatives in Australia, but in Australia's case, there are other factors. Peter Dutton took some policy positions that were not compelling electorally, but he also echoed Trump-like remarks that did not resonate with the Australian electorate very well at all. So, and there was, to be fair, there's a lot of sympathy for Canada in Australia too, because as I say, we're like-minded. There's a lot of commonalities. I call it, in my thesis, I call it strategic cousins, right? Cousins, siblings know each other well, like brothers and sisters, they know each other very, very well. Cousins, not necessarily so, depending on your parents. Because if you're close, you might know them well, but some cousins you don't know very well at all, right? And that's a bit like Australia and Canada. They're far away from each other, but they are very, very similar. And so when they do find each other, they think, oh, geez, that's a surprising amount in common. So that's why I think it's an interesting point of reference. And of course, we are in many forums with Canada. So we're in APEC, we're in the Five Eyes, we're in, they've invited us into things that we've encouraged them to join ASEAN-related things because we think their voices are a voice of reason on a range of issues that we agree with them on. They're well disposed to, the same sorts of things. So lots of parallels there. Yeah, so was this about Trump? It was definitely a factor, but domestic politics were also a factor. In Canada's case, Pierre Poilievre had a acerbic, sharp edge to him politically it was perhaps a little bit unsubtle, not very sophisticated, if I can put it that way. And I think that when combined with the Trump rhetoric, really worked against him. And similarly, Peter Dutton in Australia, former policeman, took some hardline positions on some issues, and then backtracked on a couple of them, and then took policy positions that weren't thought through fully, and combined that with Trump, and all of a sudden, Bush, you lose by a landslide, and all of a sudden, the guy who was there, who was actually not doing so well politically, the Prime Minister Albanese, all of a sudden emerges like a hero, because he's not the Trump figure. He's not somebody who looks like Donald Trump or sounds like Donald Trump. There you go.
Thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you so much, Prof. Blacklands. There is another interesting questions regarding Australian domestic politics. This is coming from Patra. He asked why every Australian Prime Minister's the first country visit is to Indonesia, and also why every Australian Prime Minister's background are former Minister of Finance and Economy.
That's a great question. So I don't know if it's always finance and economics. I don't think Albanese, the current Prime Minister, was not a finance or economic minister. He came from other portfolios. But there has been a tradition of John Howard, Paul Keating. It's not a universal rule. So I don't know that you can quite put it quite like that. But visiting Indonesia, it's partly as a mark of respect. We know Indonesia's always been really important for Australia, even though not many people speak Bahasa in Australia, even though the depth of our relationship could be much broader and deeper. There is an appreciation that what happens in Indonesia matters enormously to Australia, and that we have to get the relationship right. And the most important thing in that is to be respectful. And that's what it's about. It's about being deferential and respectful to Indonesia, a country that is our immediate neighbor. It's the gateway to Asia. It's 10 times our population. It's growing economically. It deserves our respect, and it is for that. Let's not forget, we have been alongside Indonesia going back to 1947, when we helped support your membership accession to the United Nations. Australia's been a friend of Indonesia for a long, long time. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily always show very much, because our economic interests and our security interests sometimes take us in different directions. I mean, our major trading partners are in Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, the US. Our trade with Indonesia is not top tier, right? But there's a recognition we need to do more on the education front, on the investment front, on the trading front, on the industry front. There's more we can do, and we're doing more on policing, on counterterrorism, on defence and security, and education. So there's a recognition that this has to happen, but it's tricky because in some respects, we're competitors. You sell the same kinds of things we do to Northeast Asia. And so there are rub points there sometimes, so that we're not sometimes on some issues we're not natural partners. So for instance, on some rare earths, we can be competitors, and we can be played by China. And I think we both should be aware of this. We can be played by China can play us off each other, because we're competing in the same kind of space for the same kind of products. And this is, I think, where Australia and Indonesia should be conferring with each other more frequently with the long term in mind, so that we don't get played against each other. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting point of view, Prof. Blaxland. From bilateral relations, maybe we can move on to Dayat's questions, who asked about more in a regional context. So he asked about how do you see Australia's role in ASEAN, particularly in the context of growing cybersecurity and also the shifting dynamics of global power?
Thank you. So there's two schools of thought in Australia about ASEAN. One is that ASEAN is critically important and is central, and another is that ASEAN is a broken reed, and it's dysfunctional and non-effective, and we should not place so much emphasis on it. I am of the view, and the government manifestly is of a similar view, that ASEAN is critically important. Yes, it's dysfunctional. Yes, it's problematic. Yes, it's got its limitations. Yes, it hasn't solved the Myanmar crisis. Yes, it hasn't solved the South China Sea crisis. Nonetheless, what has happened since ASEAN was created is phenomenal. When ASEAN was signed, the agreement was signed in 1967, Southeast Asia was war-torn, poverty-stricken, disease-ridden, and people visited with a camouflage uniform and a gun, right? That's why you went to Southeast Asia back then. In the intervening 60 years, it has become a successful, dynamic, prosperous, healthy, peaceful, popular tourist destination and investment destination. That is an incredible transformation that has happened in the period that ASEAN has existed. Now, as an academic, I know that correlation does not equal causation, right? But the correlation is profound, right? So yes, it's not necessarily causation, but it is a very strange coincidence that it's overlapped, right? My point is that ASEAN, careful what you wish for. ASEAN has enduring relevance. You know, all those people who decry ASEAN and its ineffectiveness, you don't want it to go away, right? It still has enduring utility and efficacy. And that is why successive Australian governments continue to support ASEAN. We have an ASEAN ambassador who I had lunch with when last time I was in Indonesia. We believe in ASEAN. We really see it as important. And it's not perfect. And I think Manes could help mitigate the risks and limitations of ASEAN, but we still strongly believe in it, and I do too. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you so much, Prof. Blaxland. That's an excellent answer. And maybe for the last, can you make a closing statement that can also ending this session as well?
Sure. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about Australia and ASEAN and Australia and Indonesia. We don't know each other as well as we should. I would encourage you to think about study in Australia in a way I encourage Australians to think about study in Indonesia. We need to understand each other and know each other better. We share this corner of the globe. We have a vested interest in looking after each other. What happens in Indonesia has effects in Australia and vice versa. So our stories are intertwined. No one is ever going to tow us away. And as we look at the spectrum of challenges that present themselves today, great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution, we need each other more than ever. So on that note, I'll thank you and end. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Blaxland. And that's the end of these guest lecture sessions. Once again, thank you so much, Professor Blaxland, for the insight and also new perspective for us regarding about not only about the regional security issues, but also how we need to see this regional security issue on both perspective, both from Australia and also from Southeast Asian countries, and how we should cooperate more with each other in the future. Once again, thank you so much for Professor Blaxland, and thank you so much for all the participants who joined in this evening. And this is the end of the sessions. Thank you. Let's close the sessions. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening and good morning to you, Prof. Blaxland.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Terima kasih.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Prof. Blaxland. Have a good day.
Thank you.